Alice adjusted the collar of her blazer, staring into the bathroom mirror. The reflection staring back at her wasn't tired, it was resigned. She tucked a stray strand of chestnut hair back into her neat bun and tried to steel herself for the day. Her phone buzzed on the counter, another notification reminding her of an overdue email from a client. As a marketing manager climbing the corporate ladder, Alice's life was built on relentless deadlines, strategic wins, and proving she was indispensable. But as she glanced down at her wedding ring, a faint bitterness twisted her chest. Daniel was outside, kneeling in the backyard garden, carefully pruning a row of marigolds. He was humming to himself, his brow furrowed in that contented way of his that used to make her smile. Now it just irritated her. How could he find so much joy in something so small? Alice turned away, grabbing her phone and her keys. "Did you call the plumber about the sink?" she asked curtly as she passed the sliding door. He looked up, blinking against the sunlight, his hands dirt-streaked. "I'll get to it," he said, his voice calm, unbothered. "I just wanted to finish this first." "Finish this?" Alice bit the inside of her cheek. The sink had been leaking for over a week. She had reminded him twice already. She had written the phone number on a sticky note and left it on the fridge. It wasn't a hard task. But Daniel had a knack for putting off what didn't interest him, and right now, the garden seemed to hold all his attention. "I'll handle it," she snapped, her voice sharp. She didn't wait for his response as she walked out the door. Later that night, the house was silent except for the faint scratching of Daniel's pen as he graded papers at the kitchen table. Alice scrolled through Instagram on the couch, her thumb pausing over a post from a college friend. Melissa had just been promoted to senior vice president. The caption read, "Hard work always pays off." The photo showed Melissa surrounded by smiling colleagues, a glass of champagne in her hand. Alice's stomach tightened. Melissa had started in marketing around the same time as her, but unlike Alice, she wasn't dragging along a partner who seemed content to coast through life. She glanced at Daniel. His head was bowed, a soft smile on his face as he read through a student's essay. His shirt was rumpled, and his hair was still dusted with dirt from his earlier gardening. He looked settled. Too settled. While Alice pushed herself to exhaustion, Daniel reveled in the safety of his tenured position as a college ecology professor. He'd never cared about promotions or accolades. He didn't care about appearances. And worst of all, he didn't care how his choices, or lack of them, made her feel. "Are you hungry?" Daniel asked suddenly, looking up. "No," she said, more sharply than she intended. "I've lost my appetite." Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't press. That was his way, quiet, passive, and maddeningly unbothered by her moods. The breaking point came 2 weeks later at a dinner party. Alice had insisted Daniel come with her, knowing it was important to show a united front to her colleagues. It was a swanky affair at her boss Meredith's home, complete with waiters in black ties and a string quartet in the corner. Alice had dressed carefully, her tailored navy dress meant to signal both professionalism and elegance. Daniel, on the other hand, had thrown on the same blazer he wore to weddings and funerals, paired with scuffed shoes and a tie that didn't quite match. She had bitten her tongue as they left the house, but by the time they arrived, her frustration was simmering beneath her polished smile. Things unraveled when Meredith struck up a conversation with Daniel. "Alice tells me you're a professor," she said with her characteristic sharpness. "What exciting research are you working on?" "Oh, nothing exciting," Daniel replied, his tone light. "I teach undergrads mostly. Keeps me busy enough." Meredith's smile tightened, and Alice felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She watched helplessly as Daniel rambled about his vegetable garden, oblivious to the polite disinterest of the group. It wasn't just that he didn't fit in, he didn't even seem to care that he didn't. On the drive home, the words spilled out before she could stop them. "Do you even realize how you came across tonight?" she snapped. Daniel looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" You sounded like you didn't care, she said, her voice rising. Everyone else there was talking about their projects, their plans, their futures. And you? You talked about tomatoes. Do you know how that reflects on me? His face darkened. If you think I'm such an embarrassment, he said quietly, why did you marry me? The question hung in the air like smoke. Alice stared out the window, her stomach twisting. She didn't answer. She didn't know how to. The days that followed were marked by a heavy silence. Alice buried herself in work, staying at the office later than usual. Daniel retreated further into the garden, spending hours outside until his hands were blistered and the sun sank below the horizon. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations reduced to transactional exchanges about groceries and bills. At night, lying next to him in bed, Alice felt like they were miles apart. One evening, as she stared at the ceiling, her mind churned with questions she didn't want to face. Had she fallen out of love with him? Or had she never truly been in love, mistaking admiration for something deeper? She thought about the man Daniel had been when they first met, idealistic, passionate about his field. But now, he seemed content to drift through life, leaving her to carry the weight of their future alone. And yet, as much as his passivity infuriated her, the alternative terrified her even more. Because if Daniel wasn't the problem, then maybe it was her. The argument began as a low simmer, a passing remark over breakfast that escalated into a wildfire neither of them could control. Alice had been in the middle of rattling off her schedule for the week when Daniel casually mentioned that he might take a few days off to focus on the garden. "You're taking time off for plants?" she snapped, barely looking up from her coffee. "Meanwhile, I'm drowning in deadlines and clients who expect me to be superhuman." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but guarded. "Alice, I thought we agreed a long time ago that our lives don't have to be the same pace. I'm not trying to compete with you." Her laugh was sharp, bitter. "Compete? You'd have to try to even get on the playing field." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. It was the silence that enraged her the most, his refusal to fight back, to meet her where she was. "You know what your problem is, Daniel," she continued, standing and pacing the kitchen like a caged tiger. "You're mediocre. You're a tenured professor who's never published anything noteworthy. You're perfectly fine with being average, with never achieving more. Meanwhile, I'm out here breaking my back just to make sure we don't drown in mediocrity." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something in them that gave her pause. It wasn't anger or hurt, it was resignation. "Do you really think that little of me?" he asked quietly. Alice felt her face flush with heat, but her frustration pushed her forward. "I think you're a failure, Daniel. Not because you're not capable, but because you don't try. You've settled for this small life. And you've dragged me down with you." For a moment, he didn't move. He sat there, still and composed, as if he hadn't just been gutted by her words. Then, without a word, he stood, walked out of the kitchen, and disappeared upstairs. Alice stood frozen, her chest heaving. She expected him to come back, to say something, anything. Instead, the house was filled with the muffled sounds of drawers opening and closing, of footsteps moving purposefully. She followed the noise, her heart pounding, a sick feeling creeping into her stomach. At the bedroom door, she stopped. Daniel was packing. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling. He didn't look at her as he folded a pair of jeans and placed them into a suitcase. "I'm leaving, Alice." Her heart dropped. "What?" "No, you're not. You're just, what are you even saying?" He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the dresser. When he turned to face her, his expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "You've made it clear how you feel about me. I'm not going to stay here and be treated like some anchor weighing you down." "Daniel, stop being dramatic," she snapped, though the panic in her voice betrayed her. "You're not actually leaving. We had a fight, that's all." Couples fight. This wasn't a fight, he said, his tone calm but final. This was you telling me who you really think I am. And I believe you. Alice's mind raced as she watched him pack his belongings with precision, as if he'd been planning this for weeks. The humiliation of it all clawed at her. Daniel, the man she considered weak, was the one walking away. The thought sent a rush of fury through her veins. Fine, she said, coldly. Go. See how far you get on your own. He zipped the suitcase, slung it over his shoulder, and walked past her without another word. The sound of the front door closing behind him was like a gunshot in the silence of the house. Alice stood in the empty hallway, the echo of his departure ringing in her ears. She wanted to scream, to cry, to chase after him and drag him back inside. But instead, she sank to the floor, her chest tightening as the weight of what had just happened settled on her shoulders. For the first time in years, the house felt too big, too quiet. She looked around at the meticulously decorated walls, the expensive furniture, and the pristine floors. This was the life she'd worked so hard to build, a life of success and control. But now, it felt hollow. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's absence became an unbearable presence. Alice threw herself into work, spending long hours at the office and avoiding the emptiness of the house as much as possible. She told herself she didn't miss him, that his leaving was proof of his weakness. But late at night, when the hum of the city outside faded and the house grew still, she found herself staring at the ceiling, her chest tight with a feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't until she received an email from their mutual friend, Sarah, that Alice's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Subject: thought you should know. The email contained a single photo, Daniel standing in front of a small, run-down cabin, a shovel in one hand and a notebook in the other. His hair was messier than usual, his clothes covered in dirt, but he was smiling, a wide, unrestrained grin she hadn't seen in years. Alice's heart twisted as she stared at the image. The email explained that Daniel had rented the cabin upstate, where he was working on a research project he'd put off for years. Sarah mentioned how happy he seemed, how passionate he was about the work. The humiliation was unbearable. Not only had Daniel left, but he was thriving without her. While she drowned in deadlines and loneliness, he was out in the world, doing what he loved. The next day, Alice was in the middle of a meeting when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah, "You should come see this." Against her better judgment, she drove upstate that weekend, her stomach in knots the entire way. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from the carefully curated world Alice was used to. She parked her car and walked up the dirt path, her heels sinking into the soft ground. When she reached the clearing, she stopped. Daniel was there, surrounded by students and researchers, gesturing animatedly as he explained something about soil composition. His face was lit with enthusiasm, his hands moving as he spoke. For a moment, Alice felt like an outsider looking in on a life she didn't recognize. This wasn't the Daniel who had sat silently at dinner parties or avoided conflict at home. This was someone she barely knew, someone confident, passionate, and happy. He saw her before she could turn away. Their eyes met across the clearing, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, he nodded slightly, as if to acknowledge her presence, and turned back to his group. Alice stood there, her cheeks burning with a mix of anger and shame. She didn't stay long. On the drive back, her mind raced. She had spent so much time resenting Daniel for what he wasn't that she hadn't stopped to consider what he could be. Or worse, what he might have been without her constant criticism. Back at the house, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the suitcase he'd left behind. She had always thought she was the ambitious one, the driven one, the one with vision. But now, she wasn't so sure. For the first time, Alice wondered if she had been so focused on controlling their life that she had strangled the parts of Daniel that had once made her love him. And for the first time, she was afraid that it might be too late to fix it. The park was quieter than Alice had anticipated. It was a cool Saturday morning, the kind of day when the crispness in the air made everything feel sharper, more vivid. She arrived early, sitting on a weathered bench under a towering oak tree. Around her, joggers passed with rhythmic strides, children laughed in the distance, and the occasional dog barked at the rustling leaves. She checked her watch, her heart pounding. Daniel was never late, and she wondered if he'd even show up. When he did, she almost didn't recognize him. He was dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, a slight scruff shadowing his face. He looked relaxed in a way that made her stomach twist. He spotted her and gave a small nod before walking over. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but guarded. "Hi." She shifted on the bench to make room, but he didn't sit immediately. Instead, he looked around, as if deciding whether to stay. Finally, he settled next to her, leaving a careful distance between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of everything that had gone wrong. "Thank you for coming," Alice said finally, breaking the silence. Daniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You asked me to. I figured I owed you that much." His tone was measured, but there was no warmth in it. It stung, though she couldn't blame him. "I've been thinking about us," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "About what happened." "Have you?" he said, his lips curving into a faint, humorless smile. "Because it seemed pretty clear where you stood last time we talked." Alice flinched at the reminder. "I didn't mean what I said, Daniel. Not all of it, anyway. I was angry, and I let my frustration take over." "Frustration," he repeated, his gaze fixed on a group of ducks paddling in the nearby pond. "Frustration with me. With my life." "It's not like that," she protested. "Isn't it?" He turned to face her now, his eyes piercing. "You called me mediocre, Alice. A failure. You said I dragged you down. So tell me, what part of that wasn't true for you?" His words hit her like a blow, and for a moment, she couldn't respond. She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "I was wrong to say those things," she admitted. "But you have to understand. I've been carrying so much. The pressure, the expectations, the need to succeed. And sometimes it felt like I was doing it alone." Daniel exhaled, a slow, deliberate sound. "Alice, I never asked you to carry all of that. I've always been fine with where we were, with what we had. It was you who decided it wasn't enough." "That's not fair," she said, her voice rising. "You never wanted more, Daniel. You never pushed for anything. Do you know how lonely that made me feel? Like I was the only one fighting for a better future?" He shook his head, his expression hardening. "A better future for who? For you? For us? Or just for the version of me you wanted me to be?" Alice felt the words lodge in her throat. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she couldn't. Because deep down, she knew there was truth in what he was saying. Daniel leaned back on the bench, his gaze drifting upward to the canopy of leaves above them. "Do you know why I stayed in academia?" he asked after a moment. She shook her head, unsure where he was going with this. "Because I love it," he said simply. "I love teaching. I love seeing the light go on in a student's eyes when they finally understand how interconnected everything is, how the soil they walk on, the air they breathe, the food they eat, it's all part of a system we're responsible for. I know it doesn't come with promotions or six-figure bonuses, but it matters. And it's enough for me." Alice stared at him, her chest tightening. This wasn't the Daniel she was used to, the passive, conflict-avoiding man who let her dominate every argument. This Daniel was certain, resolute, and unapologetic about who he was. "You never told me that," she said softly. "I didn't think I had to," he replied. "But I guess that was my mistake. I thought you saw me for who I was, not who you wanted me to be." The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Alice felt exposed, as if he had peeled back all the layers she had built around herself to hide her own insecurities. "I never meant to make you feel like you weren't enough," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But you did," Daniel said, his tone steady but firm. "And the worst part is, I started to believe it. I started to think maybe you were right, that maybe I was failing you. But then I left, and for the first time in years, I felt free. I remembered what it was like to love what I do, to feel good about myself without needing someone else's approval." Alice's throat tightened. She wanted to reach out to him, to close the distance between them, but she didn't know how. "Do you still love me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated, and the pause felt like an eternity. "I don't know," he said finally, his honesty cutting through her like a knife. "I think I did, once. But now, I don't know if I can ever go back to the way things were." Alice felt the tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had come here to fix things, to find a way to bring him back, but it was slipping through her fingers. "What do you want from me?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "I want you to figure out what you want," he said simply. "Not just from me, but from yourself. Because if you're not happy with who I am, then it's never going to work." Alice nodded slowly, her mind racing. She wanted to argue, to beg him to give her another chance, but she could see the resolve in his eyes. This wasn't a man who could be swayed by apologies or promises. "I need time," she said finally. "Take it," he replied, standing up. She watched him walk away, her chest heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. She had always prided herself on being the strong one, the one who held everything together. But now, for the first time, she realized she might have been the one holding them apart. As he disappeared into the distance, Alice sat there, staring at the pond. The ducks paddled on, oblivious to her turmoil, their movements effortless and serene. She envied them, their simplicity, their ability to move forward without looking back. But she wasn't a duck. She was a woman who had spent so much of her life chasing a version of success that she had lost sight of what truly mattered. And now, as the cool breeze brushed against her skin, she realized she might have to let go of the person she thought she was to find out who she could be. Alice stared at the bottom of her wineglass, the edges of the dimly lit bar blurring into soft shadows around her. The air hummed with low conversation and the clinking of glasses, but it barely registered. She was numb. The meeting with Daniel at the park had left her feeling stripped bare, as though the man she had once thought she could mold into her vision of success had become a stranger who no longer needed her. "You look like you've had a rough day." The voice was smooth, self-assured. Alice blinked and looked up to find Brian standing over her, holding a glass of scotch. His tailored suit fit perfectly, his tie slightly loosened in a way that suggested casual confidence. She had met him once before, a networking event where her friend Megan had insisted on introducing them. He was everything Daniel wasn't, polished, ambitious, and hungry for the next big opportunity. "Something like that," Alice replied, managing a weak smile. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, already sliding into the seat across from her. Alice hesitated but didn't stop him. The emptiness inside her begged for a distraction, something to fill the void left by her crumbling marriage. Brian raised his glass. "To better days," he said with a charming grin. Alice clinked her glass against his, the sound sharp and hollow. They talked for hours, or at least it felt that way. Brian had a way of making her feel seen, his attention unwavering as she vented about work, about life, about Daniel, though she avoided mentioning his name. He nodded at all the right moments, his laugh coming easily when she made a self-deprecating joke. "You deserve more than this," he said at one point, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "You're clearly a woman who knows what she wants. Don't settle for anything less." The words landed like a spark on dry tinder. Alice felt a warmth rise in her chest, a heady mix of validation and danger. She had spent so long fighting to prove her worth, to be enough for everyone around her. And here was someone who saw her, who admired her ambition instead of resenting it. The night blurred as the drinks kept coming. When Brian suggested they head back to his place for another glass of wine, Alice hesitated only briefly. A voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning, but it was drowned out by the alcohol and the crushing need to feel wanted. Brian's apartment was as immaculate as he was. Minimalist furniture, abstract art on the walls, and a skyline view that seemed to stretch forever. He poured her a glass of red wine, but neither of them touched it. It started with a kiss, hesitant at first, but quickly escalating. His hands were confident, his touch igniting something in her that she hadn't felt in years. She told herself it was just the alcohol, just a moment of weakness. But as the night unfolded, it became something she couldn't undo. When she woke the next morning, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the reality of what she'd done crashed over her like a wave. She lay there for a moment, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, her body stiff with guilt. Brian stirred beside her, his arm draped casually across her waist. She slipped out of bed, gathering her clothes as quietly as she could. By the time she reached the elevator, her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The drive home was a blur of shame and self-recrimination. She told herself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment fueled by alcohol and desperation. But the weight of what she had done pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. When she walked through the door of the house, the silence hit her like a physical force. Daniel's absence was palpable, a reminder of the distance that had grown between them. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the remnants of the life they had built together. For days, Alice avoided Brian's texts. She buried herself in work, trying to forget what had happened. But the guilt was relentless, gnawing at her every waking moment. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror without hearing Daniel's voice in her head, "You have to figure out what you want." What she wanted was to undo the damage, to turn back time and erase the night she had spent with Brian. But the past was a weight she couldn't escape. Then, one evening, Daniel called. His name on the screen made her stomach twist. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the answer button, before finally picking up. "Hey," he said, his voice cautious. "Hi," she replied, her throat tight. "I've been thinking," he began. "About what you said. About us." Alice held her breath, her heart racing. I think we owe it to ourselves to try," he said. "But only if we're honest with each other. No more pretending, no more avoiding the hard stuff." Tears sprang to her eyes, a mix of relief and dread. "I want that too," she said quickly. "I want to fix this, Daniel. I really do." "Okay," he said softly. "Then let's meet. Talk things through. I need to know where we both stand." They agreed to meet at a cafe the next day. Alice spent the night rehearsing what she would say, trying to find the right words to explain how she had felt, how she wanted to change. But she couldn't bring herself to tell him about Brian. The thought of losing him for good was too much to bear. The meeting started off well. Daniel was calm, open, and willing to listen. For the first time in a long time, they spoke without the weight of anger or blame hanging over them. But then, as they were finishing their coffee, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression changing as he read the screen. "What is it?" Alice asked, her stomach sinking. He looked up at her, his eyes hard. "Do you know a Brian?" The blood drained from her face. "Why?" Daniel held up his phone, showing her a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "Thought you'd want to know your wife isn't as loyal as you think. Brian." Attached was a photo of Alice leaving Brian's apartment early that morning, her hair disheveled, her guilt written all over her face. "Daniel, she started, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," he said, his voice shaking. "Don't lie to me." Alice's world crumbled in that moment. She tried to explain, to apologize, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I came here ready to forgive, he said, his voice breaking. I came here thinking we could rebuild something. But this? This is... I can't. He walked out without looking back, leaving Alice sitting there, humiliated and broken. As the cafe buzzed with the sound of other people's lives, Alice realized she had made a mistake she couldn't undo. She had betrayed not just Daniel, but herself, and now there was nothing left to salvage. Daniel sat at his desk in the small cabin he now called home, staring at the divorce papers in front of him. The words blurred together as his mind replayed the moment in the cafe when Alice's betrayal had been laid bare. The text from Brian, the photo, her stunned silence, it all swirled in his head like a storm he couldn't escape. He had wanted to rebuild, to give their marriage a second chance. Even after everything, the accusations, the resentment, the years of feeling like he was never enough, he had been willing to try. But now? Now, all he felt was a deep, hollow ache in his chest, a mix of anger and sorrow that threatened to consume him. The next morning, he drove back to the city to meet with his lawyer. It was a quiet office, the kind with polished wood furniture and thick carpet that muted every sound. As he explained the situation, laying out the years of tension and the final, undeniable betrayal, the lawyer nodded sympathetically. "This isn't going to be easy," she said gently. "But it sounds like you've made your decision." "I have," Daniel replied, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. Alice received the papers 2 days later. She was at work when the courier arrived, her assistant hesitating before handing her the envelope. Alice recognized Daniel's handwriting on the return address and felt her stomach twist. She shut her office door, her hands trembling as she opened it. When she saw the words "petition for dissolution of marriage," her breath caught. She had known this was coming, how could it not, but seeing it in black and white made it real. The air seemed to leave the room as she sank into her chair, the documents slipping from her fingers. That evening, she called Daniel. He didn't answer. She tried again the next day, and the next, but each call went straight to voicemail. Finally, in desperation, she drove to the cabin. It was raining when she arrived, the sky a heavy gray that mirrored the weight in her chest. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. When Daniel opened it, his expression was unreadable. "We need to talk," Alice said, her voice shaky. He stepped aside, letting her in. The cabin was modest but cozy, a stark contrast to the pristine, lifeless house they had shared. Books were stacked on the coffee table, and a faint scent of coffee lingered in the air. "Say what you need to say," Daniel said, his tone calm but distant. Alice hesitated, unsure where to begin. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. What I did was unforgivable, and I don't expect you to forget it. But I need you to know that it didn't mean anything. It was a mistake, Daniel. A horrible, stupid mistake." He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "You think it didn't mean anything?" he said, his voice sharp. "You think that makes it better?" "I wasn't in my right mind," she pleaded. "I was hurt and confused, and I wasn't thinking straight. It doesn't change how I feel about you." Daniel laughed bitterly. "And how is that, Alice?" "Because the way you've treated me, your words, your actions, none of it has felt like love." She flinched, but pressed on. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you. But I want to fix this. I want to fight for us." He shook his head, his expression softening into something that looked almost like pity. "Alice, this isn't something you can fix with words. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything we built together, everything I thought we were working towards." "I can change," she said desperately. "I'll do whatever it takes." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't about you changing, Alice. This is about who we are. You want a life that I can't give you, and I want a life that you've never understood. And after everything that's happened, I can't stay in a marriage built on mistrust. Alice's breath hitched, her vision blurring with tears. So that's it? You're just giving up? I'm not giving up, he said firmly. I'm choosing myself for once. I deserve to be with someone who values me for who I am, not who they want me to be. The words cut deep, and Alice felt the weight of her choices crashing down on her. She had spent so long trying to mold Daniel into her vision of success that she had never truly seen him for the man he was. And now, it was too late. Daniel walked to the door and opened it, the finality of the gesture leaving no room for argument. Goodbye, Alice. She hesitated, hoping for some sign that he might change his mind, but there was none. She stepped out into the rain, her tears mingling with the drops that streaked down her face. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Daniel moved on, pouring himself into his work and finding solace in the simplicity of his new life. He began traveling for research, connecting with colleagues who shared his passion for sustainability. Alice, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild. Her career continued to thrive, but the emptiness in her personal life was a constant reminder of what she had lost. Friends who once envied her ambition began to pity her loneliness. One evening, months after the divorce, Alice attended a professional gala. The room buzzed with chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of soft music. She was in her element, surrounded by people who admired her drive and determination. But then, across the room, she spotted Daniel. He was with a group of colleagues, laughing at something one of them had said. He looked happy, truly happy in a way she hadn't seen in years. Her chest tightened as she watched him. She wanted to go to him, to say something, anything, but she knew it wouldn't matter. He had moved on, and she was just a chapter in his story now, a chapter that had ended. As she stood there, the weight of her choices pressing down on her, Alice realized something she hadn't fully understood before: success meant nothing without someone to share it with. And in her pursuit of ambition, she had lost the one person who had truly loved her. She turned away, the sound of laughter fading into the background as she walked out of the room, the realization sinking in that some mistakes could never be undone. Thank you for taking the time to read this story. It's a tale of love, betrayal, and the difficult choices that can change lives forever. Now, we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Alice and Daniel's journey? Have you ever faced betrayal or heartbreak in your own life? If you feel comfortable, share your experiences in the comments. We value every story, and your voice matters to us. Your support means everything. If you enjoyed this story or found it thought-provoking, consider subscribing to stay connected with us and explore more stories like this. Don't forget to give this a like if it resonated with you. You are truly appreciated, and we are grateful for each and every one of you. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. Take care and remember, you're never alone.